Hi, everyone. This is CricketSong with Inner Wisdom, and you're watching another episode of Wyrds, Witches, Witchcraft. I'm here with my usual co-host, Obsidian Fire. Say hello.
Hey! Bonjour tout le monde. Vous regardez un épisode pré-enregistré et aujourd'hui nous avons une invitée qui, pour la plupart d'entre vous, je pense, vous est connue.
And tonight we have a special guest, Thorn Mooney. Say hello, Thorn.
Hello. And I have Oliver with me.
Yay. If you're watching this, I just realized you're watching not a live video tonight, you're watching a pre-recorded video because today, this evening, January 25th, is my birthday. So I'm out celebrating with family and friends. So this is a special recorded video. And I know you're probably upset because then you don't get to ask Thorn all those wonderful questions that I know you have for her, but you can ask them in the comments and I'll point them out to her when I get an opportunity.
I'll keep an eye on it.
Good. She'll keep an eye on it. So tonight we're going to talk about traditional witchcraft. And if you don't know why we're talking about that, is because we have this lovely book, if you can see it, that Thorn wrote. Is it backwards? I hope it's not backwards. Traditional Witchcraft, A Seeker's Guide. I've read it. I've made notes in it. And if you haven't read it, you should read it. There'll be a link to the Amazon so you can purchase it right on Amazon. And when I looked today, it said it was on sale.
Yes.
It looked like it was on sale. So check it out. Buy yourself a copy.
Or Oliver will starve.
He will.
Let him starve.
We don't want Oliver to starve.
No.
And if you've read it, leave a review. Leave a review for her. Right now she has 48 reviews. It looks like she's got a 5-star rating. And when I looked, the one critical review gave you 3 stars. And the criticism was that the book wasn't what they expected. So,
which is fair.
Right.
Which is fair.
That was the only criticism in it. So they went in purchasing, thinking it was one thing and it wasn't. So it wasn't anything about the information itself. So even the critical review wasn't a bad review. So we're talking about traditional witchcraft, Wicca, not witchcraft. Well, we'll get into
ish, right?
Right. Well, you know what? For those of you, those who don't know you, I don't know why they wouldn't know you, but if they don't, why don't you give an introduction of who you are, what you do?
Sure. So my name is Thorn Mooney, and I am a Gardnerian priestess. For those of you who don't know, Gardnerian Wicca is, it's a tradition of Wicca, obviously. It's really the first tradition of Wicca, before Wicca was really a term that everybody knew, and before Gardnerian was a word that people knew. So Gardnerian Wicca arises in the mid-20th century in England, and it's really with the birth of that movement, and then kind of it runs into things in particularly the 60s and 70s, makes its way to the US. So the reason we have solitary eclectic Wicca, eclectic covens, really goes back to kind of what folks like Gerald Gardner and some of these early witches were doing in England in the early to mid 20th century. So I'm practicing a tradition of Wicca that is directly lineaged to those first covens. So we've got a lot in common with eclectic Wicca, but we've also got some pretty big differences. And it's a type of witchcraft, but I know this is a good trend, this thing that we're like, we shouldn't be using Wicca and witchcraft interchangeably. So when I say Wicca, I mean Wicca, and I'll use the word when that's what I want to talk about. But Wicca is a type of witchcraft. So I am a witch, I practice witchcraft. That particular witchcraft is Wicca.
Yeah.
Etc.
So going off from that, because you touched, like, I'm like, oh, I got a question about that and that. And that.
Oh, yeah.
So, okay. So let's go back. I want to start with what motivated you to write the book to begin with. What was your motive to write it?
So I love books and I love reading, and I participate in a lot of witchcraft communities. And what I found was when I would do that, when people would talk about Wicca I found that they weren't really talking about a Wicca that was familiar to me. People would make really general statements about what Wiccans believe and what Wiccans do and how Wiccans practice, and I would go, like, no, that doesn't represent me. Actually, it's the reason I started my YouTube channel however many years ago, was because I loved participating in these communities, but I didn't see voices that were like mine. And so I wanted to write a book that made it clear to folks that there were other styles of Wicca that people thought had gone extinct or just weren't around anymore or whatever, and let people know that we were still out there doing our thing. And I wanted it to be accessible just because we've got this traditional Wiccans and Gardnerians and Alexandrians in particular, we have this reputation, which is largely earned, for being elitist and being snobby and being exclusive. And I just find that that really isn't true so much anymore. And I wanted our communities to be, I wanted us to be available and open to people who might be good fits, who might be looking for what we have to offer. Yeah. So I wanted to spare my fellow coven leaders some awkward emails and, you know, just make things easier for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense to me. So with that in mind, what would you like your readers to take from the book? Is it just that your, Gardnerian, Alexandrian, traditional Wiccans or covens are available, or is there more that you want them to take away after they read it?
A couple of things. So I wrote the book. It ended up having a few purposes, and some of them were kind of unintended. I wanted, first of all, to give traditional Wiccans a voice in the conversation, and let people know kind of that we existed and also what we were up to. So the first chunk of the book is about like how initiation works for us and what the hierarchy looks like and what does it look like to actually be in a coven and those kinds of things. And I wanted to make them interesting enough so that you didn't have to be intent on becoming a traditional Wiccan in order to get something out of those chapters.
Right.
But what I was finding is I ended up kind of writing this book that was more of a guide for sort of how to interact in more formalized witchcraft communities. Mm-hmm. So I feel like a lot of what I wrote is applicable also to eclectic covens and also to non-Wiccan traditional covens. I mean, there's a whole chapter about like how to find a group that's well suited, how to write initial emails without sounding like a jackass, like that kind of stuff. And there's a whole chapter about like how to avoid predatory groups. So, and those things are not specific to Wicca.
No, they're not.
So I think of it like maybe kind of a less sugar and sunshine sort of guide to getting involved in witchcraft communities.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Because you're right. Because I mean, if I think back to over a year ago when I was running a eclectic, non-traditional Wiccan coven, a lot of the points that you made in the emails and how to approach wanting to join, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was not in a lineage. I was not part of any of that, but I'd get similar emails. And I'm like, if people would have approached it in the way that you presented it here, they might have gotten my attention.
Yeah.
It was good.
I wanted to write something that, because I was getting frustrated as a new high priestess running her first group, kind of dealing with these messages from people and being like, really? Like, I can't believe this person said this to me. And like, after years of like, oh God, this email, like I wanted to sort of spare other priests and priestesses that kind of awkwardness. Like, how do I talk to this person who like might be a good seeker, but I don't know because look what they actually typed in this message.
Right. Yeah.
I want to kind of help people navigate that stuff.
Yeah. And it's helpful. The information I think is very helpful. So I know you talk about this in the book, but for our conversation, I mean, when you talk Wicca, how would you define Wicca? I guess. How would you define that as opposed to witchcraft?
Sure. Okay, so I spent a lot of time cogitating on this, okay? Because first I want to make it clear that when I say Wicca, I'm not trying to exclude eclectic Wiccans. I feel like we've got a lot in common. We've got this big community, and I'm fine with the distinction of, I use traditional versus eclectic. I don't love the word traditional because I don't think that it really means anything, okay? So when I say Wicca, if I mean like coven-based traditional Wicca, then I'll use that expression. If I mean eclectic, solitary, or whatever, like I'll specify. But in terms of this conversation about what is Wicca and what is witchcraft, that's really difficult, but here's what I've come up with. And you guys check me if you don't like it, okay? Because this is a definition in progress. The biggest difference I see is because I'm thinking about like the big traditional authors right now, people like Laura Tempest Zakroff and Chris Orpello and Tara Love. They just released a book. Like the folks who are writing about traditional witchcraft right now, Gemma Gary.
Book?
There you go. Yep. You guys should buy that one too.
I just ordered that book. I have yet to read it. And
yeah, they're awesome.
Really
but I think the big difference, because we're all talking to spirits. We're all hedge crossing and going between the worlds, and we're practicing magic, like we're all doing those things. But I think the thing that makes Wicca different it's not the love and light stuff, and it's not the Wiccan read or whatever, because that stuff isn't consistent amongst Wiccans either. The difference—
Thank you for saying that. I just got to interject. Yeah. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, like that stuff isn't consistent either. I think the biggest difference is that Wicca, unlike traditional witchcraft, has this really steeped history in Hermeticism and the Western magical ceremonial tradition. Like Wicca has really clear ties to things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. We've got links with the OTO. Like we very clearly come out of a particular time and place in particularly English history. Whereas traditional witchcraft more broadly tends to be regional. It tends to have a lot of variation depending on where you are and what time period. Wicca is like super duper hermetic. Like, even if we don't usually talk in that language, most of the Wiccans I know don't know anything about Hermeticism. Most of the Wiccans I know they're not interested in Kabbalah, like whatever. But even if we're not interested, and even if that's not something we know about, you can see elements of that stuff in what we do. Right? Like this idea that, oh, the East is associated with air and the intellect. Like that comes from a place.
Yes, it does.
So I think that's the big defining difference for me, is that Wicca is part of this Western mystery tradition, whereas witchcraft might come from any other sort of place or etc. Like, does that make sense?
And going with that, I think I would say when you're watching someone practice their craft, I think you can tell. I maybe not, but again, this is just like an observation. Someone who is Wiccan or rooted in a Wiccan practice and someone who is not. Like, are you casting a circle? Oh, check. Are you calling quarters? Oh, check. Are you using some form of invocation or evocation of elements and spirit or deity? Oh, check. I mean, I think you can kind of at least get an understanding that, well, you might be a Wiccan, maybe, kind of thing.
If you've got yourself, a magical knife and you're like drawing pentagrams in the air and in a quartered circle, like that, I mean, sorry guys, like that's not like ancient witchcraft practice. Like it's just not. So yeah, I think it's pretty recognizable. But at the same time, I don't want to get like super hung up on those differences, just because I think the histories are really interested, and I think they're important, especially because Wicca has really monopolized the limelight for so long. But the solution is not to come out and throw Wicca under the bus, because your real traditional witchcraft is so much realer and more authentic. Like, that's also just objectively not true.
I agree. I agree. I mean, I personally think authenticity, it starts from within. I mean, you know, it starts with you. If you're just, if you're doing things with intention, if you're doing things with focus, if you're doing these things from an honest place, from, you know, and you're being truthful with yourself, then what you're doing is authentic. I mean, yeah.
So here's my bad analogy, if I can just say. This is what I tell people sometimes. So in the book of Exodus, right, let's get biblical for a second. There's this wonderful scene where Moses goes to the temple with the pharaohs, and he's like, well, my God is bigger than your gods. And the priests of the pharaohs are like, oh yeah, well, like, I can turn this staff, like, we can do magical shit, right? And Moses is like, all right, well, here's this staff. Let's see, you can turn it into a snake. Okay. And they're both competing to see, like, whose God does the thing best. And it just comes down to this thing where it's like, okay, like, Moses's God does the best magic tricks, basically. And I think, okay, like, I'm practicing witchcraft, you're practicing witchcraft, but can you turn the staff into a snake? Like, does your magic work? Is it effective? Are you doing the thing well? Then, like, yeah, it's real. Like, who cares?
Exactly. 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 So with understanding that there definitely is a difference between Gardnerian, Alexandrian, traditional Wicca and eclectic Wicca, or what we see people call Wicca, not and separate from witchcraft. There's definitely a difference, right? I mean, right. What would that difference be
between, like, traditional and more eclectic styles? So in the way I define it, and I don't get so limited as to say traditional Wicca is just Gardnerian and Alexandrian either, as I've thought about this, just because I think that there are some eclectic traditions that started out in a particular way, being kind of do-it-yourself, but Wicca's been around for like 70 plus years at this point, and people have been practicing eclectic Wicca for years at this point, and they've figured out how tradition works. So there are a lot of traditions that have this eclectic background that now operate in very similar ways. A good example is Blue Star Wicca, which doesn't necessarily have the sort of lineage that Gardnerians like to talk about, but they operate in the same fashion. So it depends on kind of where you are in Blue Star as to whether or not you think it's BTW. But to me, it's not just about lineage. I think that we also need, for my definition, I'm looking at coven-based Wicca, initiatory Wicca, lineaged Wicca. I'm looking at hierarchy, and I'm looking at an emphasis on experience and practice over belief. Those were kind of my 5 touchstones in the book. Not all traditions have all 5 of those things, but I found that most of them did. And there are a lot of eclectic practitioners who have some of those things. So that's kind of the ballpark I'm operating in.
Right, right. So let's talk about initiation briefly.
Okay.
Because you mentioned that in there. And there's this whole, debate, self-initiation.
That's a nice word for it.
Debate, right? That's how I like to.
Yeah.
It's a debate, right? So how would you define initiation? And then I guess in that, can a individual initiate themselves into anything, I guess, actually?
So my background is in religious studies and anthropology, and I like to, call it cowardice, but I like to turn back to kind of my scholarly training to define things.
Right,
and,
right.
And so when anthropologists talk about initiation, they're usually referring to the ideas of these dudes, primarily Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner. And both of them were writing about how they were doing ethnography, so they were hanging out with folks in contained communities and looking at rites of passage. And what they found was rites of initiation. What they do is they take people from one stage of life and they move them into another stage of life. Like, that's fundamentally what an initiation is. And they defined them in terms of, okay, you've got this sort of preliminary stage. Let's say like boyhood to manhood. That's a pretty good example. So someone starts out as a boy, they become a man, and there's some kind of rite of passage in between. And what that rite of passage is varies from culture to culture. For some groups, it's circumcision, right? You're circumcised as an adult or as an adolescent, and that's what defines your manhood. And there's this whole ritual behind it. So there's kind of this, Victor Turner called it a liminal stage, and liminal is a word that people know at this point. But it basically means like in the middle, in between. So initiation takes you out of one stage, puts you through this liminal period where you're kind of in the middle, and then it spits you out in a different role in a community.
So it's like a rebirth.
It's like, yes, exactly. Basically, you're reborn different. And what's critical about that is that it's a community process. So you don't just go from boy to man living by yourself in the woods. As far as the community is concerned, it's kind of like, you think about the ritual of bar mitzvah for Jewish boys. Like, it's this ritual through the temple that acknowledges one's adulthood. One's manhood is the ability to participate in the temple. It doesn't mean that legally you're a man and you can vote, because these are 13-year-olds for the most part. But ritually, there's this rite of manhood. And to me, that's what a Wiccan initiation does. It takes you from being an outsider, takes you through this ritual process, and then spits you out as a priest or priestess of that tradition, okay, as a witch, right? So can you do that by yourself? Well, it depends on whether or not you think that the crux of that is community. Most anthropologists would say that it's a communal event. It takes place within a community. You need community acknowledgement for it to be part of that kind of pattern. So that said, that doesn't mean that people don't have profound experiences alone, of course. So it's really tricky. The takeaway there, I think, is that we have to just understand that initiation happens in these groups, and for traditional Wicca, it is communal. So if your tradition allows for something like self-initiation, or if you believe that your God has initiated you or whatever, I'm not going to refute that. But if you want to be a Gardnerian, we're a community, and you have to go from insider through our ritual process and then come out in order to be accepted by our group. Just like I don't get to be a Jewish man, okay? Like I have to meet certain criteria and go through the rite of bar mitzvah, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm kind of being tongue in cheek here, but I can't just declare myself a Catholic priest.
Right.
I can't just declare myself a Freemason or a doctor. That's the example I use in the book. Like, we expect doctors to have gone through medical school and a residency and et cetera. And I'm not saying that being a Wiccan is like being a doctor, but fundamentally we understand this idea that you have to go through a thing, a liminal stage, your training, and then you get spit out on the other side as a different person.
Yeah.
And that's how traditional Wiccan initiations operate.
I think a lot of spiritual or religious communities have that sort of thing. Because I'm just thinking back to my Roman Catholic days. I mean, confirmation is very much like an initiation. Exactly. You know, you have to have all the other sacraments, but you go through education and understanding of why the Catholics do what they do during Mass and blah, 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 before you can say, I accept my role within this community, and then you can take on other positions within that community. Obviously, you're not going to be a priest, but it's a step into that community. It's very similar.
That's a great example. So I'm engaged, and my mother's family is Catholic. But I wasn't confirmed in the church. So people ask, well, are you going to have a Catholic wedding? Well, no, because I'm not a Catholic. It doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter how my parents feel. I did not go through this ritual process to become a Catholic. I can't just decide to have a Catholic wedding. That's not how it works. There's no Catholic church that's going to go, okay, cool, like sign on up. It's the same thing with like an Alexandrian coven. If you want to like download a ritual and perform it in your bedroom, that's awesome. And if you have a spiritual experience and it changes your life, that's cool. But the Alexandrians aren't going to invite you over for circle.
Yeah, no,
like,
and they're not going to recognize that.
No. So the question is, do you care? And if you don't care, and if you're having a spiritual experience, then good for you. But if you want to be an Alexandrian, then you've got to play by Alexandrian rules.
Exactly, exactly. Because I can sit down and I can think, you know, I've had a very profound personal, you know, spiritual experience, and I might call that an initiation between me and my gods at the time. Sure. But I would never expect to come to your coven, Thorn, and say, oh yeah, I'm initiated.
Right.
No, I mean, that wouldn't make sense to me.
And I think that's the crux of it for me. Like, I'm not getting online telling people that their self-initiations are invalid, but I'm perfectly comfortable saying that somebody isn't a Gardnerian.
Exactly.
Like, I feel like I have the authority to say that sometimes, but I don't have the authority to say what goes on between you and your deities and your ritual space. That's up to you. And if you had an initiatory experience, then awesome. But I do know what it takes to be a Gardnerian, and you've either done it or you haven't.
Right, right.
It's pretty cut and dry.
So, question for you. Well, actually, here's like a two-part question. Are all witches Wiccan, and are all Wiccans witches?
See, you're going to get me in trouble. So
again, this is like a debate I've had and conversations I've had with people. So
this is cool. I can talk about this stuff for sure. So all witches are 100% not Wiccan. Okay. There are lots and lots of different kinds of witches in the world. You can look at witchcraft throughout history, and we might have lots of stuff in common or not or whatever, but Wicca is definitely a type of witchcraft. I would say most of the witches who I hang out with these days are not Wiccan. And they do different things, and that's awesome. Wicca, on the other hand, the word literally means witch. Like, that's just true. And I realize that there are people who say that you can be Wiccan without being a witch, and that witchcraft is a thing that gets added to Wicca. And that is not something that I agree with. And I realize I'm stepping on some toes here, but you know, we're all grown-ups, and I'm open always to friendly debate. But I think what side you fall on really depends on what you think witchcraft is. And the thing in my mind is that if you're practicing Wicca, there are certain things that you're probably doing. You're probably casting a magic circle. You're probably celebrating Sabbats. There's things that you're probably doing. And those things are magical. Like, those...
I'm not casting spells, Thorn. I don't do magic spells. I'm not a witch. I'm just a Wiccan.
If you are casting a circle to worship or practice in between the worlds, then like, you're doing magic.
Yeah. That's not spell casting. That's not magic. That's just ritual.
Yeah. So it raises questions about what you think magic is and what witchcraft is. And I don't know, like, I think for me, Wicca is very much, it's a practice. It's a thing that you do. And there are a set of things that are involved in being Wiccan. Even eclectics and solitaries, like, we still kind of do the same stuff. And if you're not doing those things, then I'm not sure that you are doing Wicca. Okay. And I'm not going to get in a fight with anybody about it because I'm too busy and I don't care. But
it's my beliefs. Wicca is my spirituality. It's what I believe.
Yeah.
I don't practice anything. I just believe it. And I think you addressed that between orthodoxy and orthopraxy.
Yeah, I definitely do. And for me, I wish you could see Oliver. He's all cute and curled up. Oliver has been present at many initiations. He knows the universe. That's true. Thank you. Yes. Yes. So in the book, I talk about orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, which is an old conversation at this point. We've seen it online. But kind of one of the points I make is that they're really not discrete things. It's not like you do one or the other, right? Like your practice implies beliefs and your beliefs imply practice. Like they're really entangled. But Wicca tends to emphasize practice and what you do. And there are certain things that you can look and like Wiccans do these things, right? This ideas about the quartered circle. There are particular things we do with our tools. We might believe
tools, right? I mean, even like, they use tools.
Yeah. So you and I might be Wiccans, and we might have very different ideas about like the nature of the gods or cosmology or whatever. But if we're running around waving like a ritual dagger in a quartered circle and like calling on elements and like we're doing things that are pretty well established as Wiccan. And if you're not doing those things, if you just are like believing in stuff, I don't know, like.
Can you be a non-practicing Wiccan?
I don't, you know, I want to, so I don't want to be too hard-nosed here because it's not like we don't have slumps where people don't want to do things. Like I've been in slumps where I'm just like, I just cannot be bothered to circle, and they'll go on for months. I've dealt with clinical depression like my whole life. And so there are definitely times where I don't want to do things. Does that mean I'm not Wiccan in those periods? Well, no. Okay. But I don't know. So I don't want to draw super hard lines one way or the other, but we can observe tendencies, and the tendency is that Wicca involves doing stuff.
Just like I think witchcraft involves doing stuff. It's a craft. It's a practice. And I mean, like with your idea with, you know, if you have a teacher certificate and then you're not teaching for a few years, does that mean you're no longer a teacher?
I don't know. Like you have the skill set, but are you actually doing the thing? Well, no. I don't know. Oh. So, but that's tricky because there are beliefs involved. And if I'm maintaining those things, like, because I don't feel like I wouldn't be a witch or I wouldn't be a Wiccan, but I don't know. That's super messy.
It is because, you know, I think I started the conversation or the idea of talking with you, believing one thing, but now that we're kind of talking about it, I'm like, well,
yeah,
maybe, I guess, I mean, for me, I mean, if I claim to be Wiccan and then say I am no longer, say I was even initiated into a traditional coven, and then I stopped participating in coven rituals and I stopped going to meetings and I'm in a slump for whatever reason. And then maybe I move and I'm no longer, you know, associated with that because I'm too far away. But I haven't yet joined a coven out here.
That happens.
Am I still Wiccan? I mean, what if I'm not doing anything? Maybe I'm looking for a job and I've kind of neglected my practice. How long does that go for? I feel like at some point your relationship with the spirits and with your practice is going to deteriorate so much.
Right. But one of the key principles behind initiation is that you can't go back. It fundamentally changes you.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
Like, for example, if you're initiated as a Gardnerian, that initiation doesn't expire. The oath still holds, right? Like all of those things still hold, even if and this happens all the time. Somebody moves away and there isn't a coven nearby. Somebody gets married or has kids or whatever, and life gets in the way. Sometimes you just can't dedicate, you know, driving to ritual a few times a month. And I think that's really normal. And that person doesn't stop being a Gardnerian. We talk about them
convert to Christianity.
Then I think it depends on what you have to say as a Christian, I guess. I mean, if you renounce the tradition before, I mean, probably nobody's going to invite you over to coffee and circle, so that problem's solved. And if your current religion doesn't accept, then I think that definition's probably up to them.
Because if initiation changes you, fundamentally changes you, because everything she touches, she changes, right? then you denounce that and say you join a church, a Christian church, and say, well, say you go through catechism, because that's a good example. I understand Roman, you know, and you start going through they don't call it catechism anymore. I don't know what they call it.
Do they not?
They don't. My dad told me, he's still part of the church. He goes, no, they don't call it that.
Damn Vatican II ruining things.
Right. But you go through and you get your sacraments, and then you're confirmed. Like you said, your coven mates are probably not going to invite you to circle and coffee anymore. But I'm curious. I want to talk to someone who's gone through that.
Well, it goes both ways, right? If I'm confirmed and baptized as a Catholic, and then I go get a Wiccan initiation, the church still thinks I'm a Catholic. Like,
not unless you write a letter and you denounce yourself.
There you go. Okay. Maybe we need some kind of thing where everybody sends me letters when they stop being Wiccan, and then I can keep some sort of logbook.
Yeah, like the church.
Yeah, there you go, guys. Get started on that. I've got a P.O. box.
But I mean, even separate from the outside community, I'm curious as to what that does. I mean, to that, you know, that individual experience, what that, I guess, I don't know. I'd really, if you're out there and you happen to stumble upon this live stream, which will not be live at the time, and you've gone through something like that, please talk to me, because I can only talk about, you know, leaving the Catholic Church, becoming a Jehovah's Witness, renouncing Jehovah's Witness to follow this paganish, then Wiccan, and whatever is going on now. I can speak to that transition for me, but I'm curious about other people's experiences.
Well, I think maybe too, like, so you can't unknow something once you know it. You can refute it and you can denounce it, but you can't unknow it. So I'm thinking about like what happened recently with Doreen Virtue and some of these other folks who've left, where, okay, even if you denounce something, you still can't undo the things that you learned, or the things like the foundation that you built with the thing. Like whatever Doreen Virtue does in the future, she's going to be known for the work that she did in New Age communities.
Right.
And a lot of her insight as a Christian is going to come from some of these experiences she had, which is why I think we have so many ex-witch ministries. Right? Like your understanding of theology and how you interact with the world and your social, religious organization, like whatever, are informed by your experiences as a witch, even if you're now an ex-witch. So like, I did my master's thesis in religion on evangelical megachurches because I'm weird. And I spent 2 years going to a church, and I volunteered on one of their teams. And it wasn't like weird subterfuge or anything. Like everybody knew I was a researcher, and everybody had to sign paperwork that said I was allowed to be there. But I found that a lot of my ability to be compassionate and to work with these folks and kind of understand what they were up to came from some of the magical training that I'd had as a Wiccan priestess. Like I understood gifts of the spirit and glossolalia, speaking in tongues, because I'd seen transpossession rituals in pagan spaces. Like I understood devotion because I'm Wiccan. I'm devoted to a deity. Like, so there were certain things that translated much more evenly than I thought they would. And I had this thought frequently that, hey, I think I'd actually be a really good evangelical because I already have this skill set that kind of works. It kind of transfers.
Yeah, it does. So, and I agree.
Yeah, if I were to decide that I wasn't going to be a Gardnerian priestess anymore and I was going to run off and join a worship band or something like with a big megachurch, even if I denounced my Wiccan background, I would still be pulling tools from it, I think. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
So in that sense, I don't think that's what I mean when I say like initiation can't be undone.
I agree. I agree with that. With that perspective and that context, I agree.
But it's messy for sure.
Oh, right.
Right.
It's so interesting. This is gonna give me food for thought later on.
Cool.
I really want to share a at this point before we run out of time. I want to share how much your book impacted my own path. For those of you who have been watching my channel for a while, I moved from the East Coast, from Massachusetts, out here to the West Coast, and now live in Seattle. And during that transition, or actually probably a year prior to the transition, when my husband and I came out here for vacation, things in our lives, we had decided that, within a year, we'd like to be out here because he's from Washington. And at that time, when you put something out to the universe and you ask the gods, hey, this is what I want to do, they get right on it, right? So within that time, the coven dissolved, and at that point, my own spiritual paths was shifting and changing. And, I had freedom. I didn't have to worry about how I was going to impact a group of people, what my practice, if it was going to go in a different direction, I didn't have to really worry about what was happening. So it's sort of exploded. My life started to explode, and ties were getting severed everywhere, preparing me for this transition. So within this transition, I'm like, okay, the amount of time I started circling, doing my own circles, started to dwindle a little bit, and my practice started shifting, and my relationship with the gods that I was working with at the time kind of transitioned to something else. And when I moved out here, I was finally away from the energy of the land. And the land here, the energy is very different out here. So my relationship with the land is changing, and the energies and what I work with and the spirits I work with is changing and shifting. And I began to question, and having conversations with people like Obsidian Fire. I don't know. I'm a witch. I will always be a witch, but I'm not too sure if I'm Wiccan anymore. And lo and behold comes this book by Thorn that sort of defines Wicca, at least.
Ruining things for people. Yeah.
No, actually, it didn't ruin things for me. It really made me go, you know what? All these points she's making in this book, and yeah, that's right. You're right. Oh my gosh. I didn't think of it that way. It made me realize that, no, I'm not Wiccan anymore. I don't follow that very ritualistic path anymore. And it was like, yeah, I need to let that sort of label go, because I cannot, knowing this and understanding this, I feel like it's already stuff I knew, but I needed someone to say, wake up, CricketSong, you already know this. Read the tea leaves,
That's actually in the acknowledgments. Wake up, crickets.
I know, it is right here. Look at that. It says it right there.
You're not one of us.
No, it's not. It's just not what I am aligned with right now. But you know how difficult it is for other people to not assume that anymore. But it did. It sort of gave me freedom. It sort of said, it's okay. Your book said, it's okay. It's okay.
Well, and you asked me at the beginning, why I was writing it and what I wanted. And that's part of it. I think, and this is one of the reasons why people get so bent out of shape about the confusing Wicca and witchcraft, is because there is this kind of distinction, and it's just as bad to be trying to shove yourself into a box where you don't belong as it is to not know where you belong at all. And there's a lot of people out there who are describing themselves as Wiccan. They're exploring Wicca, and that's awesome. But there are so many other options available, and there's so many other teachers and resources and whatever. And it's just as important that people know that those exist, and that you don't have to be Wiccan. We'd all be a lot happier if we just kind of knew what was out there and were honest with ourselves.
Exactly. And I like the you go through the witch's pyramid here in your book, and know yourself, obviously. That's my favorite favorite part of it all, because if you can know yourself and be honest with yourself, then everything else can fall in line. If you're deceiving yourself, then forget anything beyond that, because you don't even know if you're being truthful. But yeah, I remember having conversations, and on my blog, on my website, I go through the witch's pyramid, and I go through the tenets as I saw. Having conversations with people who are initiated in Gardnerian and Alexandrian covens, and really having conversations about what is Wicca and what isn't Wicca. Looking at the tenets that I came up with, and realizing that, if you don't fit in, or if you're not following ritual being a big part of it, if you're not following these kind of things, then maybe you're not Wiccan, and that's okay. You don't have to be Wiccan. You can be a witch. You can just practice witchcraft. But your book really was sort of that, what I needed. I needed that. Cool. Sort of thing, and I want to thank you for that, because if you didn't write it, I might still be going, probably still Wiccan. I don't know.
Well, I'm glad.
So it might be strange to some people to say, oh, her book let you know you're not Wiccan. Yeah, no, but that's a good thing.
That was the working title. You're not really Wiccan.
Exactly. That would be a great title. Can you imagine? I mean,
I know Llewellyn was like, I think that's too negative.
Right. I mean, but any publicity is good publicity, right? I mean, all them talking about, how, oh my God, I can't believe she said that. That's still great publicity.
Yeah.
I wanted to just talk too briefly about the further reading, because a couple of the books I went, I love that book. I can't believe she put that as further reading, because it's not Wiccan. American Gods. Oh my God, I read that last year and I loved it.
Yeah.
I was glad to see American Gods by Neil Gaiman on here.
I think it's the only book that I actually require of outer court people.
Really?
Yeah, other people are like, oh no, you've got to read Meaning of Witchcraft. And I'm like, you have to read Neil Gaiman.
Oh my God, if I saw that, I'd be like, oh, I want to join her coven. She's making me read American Gods. How cool is that? And there was another one by Terry Pratchett. Yes.
Small Gods, yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, she's having them read that. How cool is that?
Well, both of these books are really accessible, and they are really interesting ways to start a conversation about worship and what we're doing and what does devotion mean and polytheism, and looking at kind of various kinds of pagan cosmologies. Because let's be real, nobody actually reads Robert Graves. I don't think anybody in the history of the world has actually read The White Goddess cover to cover. I think we're all just lying, because guys, some of these people just don't read that stuff. If I gave people a reading list that was you have to read Meaning of Witchcraft, Gerald Gardner, you have to read The White Goddess, you have to read The Golden Bough, dude, nobody reads James Fraser. They just don't.
Oh my God, The Golden Bough. Okay, so I picked it up. I bought it from Amazon. I picked it up. I'm reading it, and I enjoy reading. I'm an avid reader. I turned to my husband. I said, I don't know how much more I can read of this. It's still sitting on my bookshelf with my bookmark. When you get to the Law of Contagion, and I'm like, oh my God, this just goes on forever. I already know the concept. Why? And then the next one, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't. I couldn't. I put it down.
That stuff is valuable, and I've read that stuff. I read some of that stuff in grad school, okay? But what would happen if I had those things on my reading list and I required those of everybody, then witchcraft would be some kind of weird intelligentsia where only scholars could join.
Exactly.
That's totally dumb. So it's much easier. There's so many books on the market. There's no reason to use Graves to talk about the goddess. You can, but there's so much other material out there now. You don't need to use Fraser to talk about dying god cycles or the law of contagion,
how magic works.
And it's valuable. And if you're around for any length of period of time, I think you should read it, or at least try to read it. But for somebody who's brand new, who's feeling this calling in their hearts, I'm not giving them Fraser. I'm not giving them Margaret Murray. I'm not giving them those things, because, and I say this as a high school teacher, they're not going to read it. They're going to lie about it, or they're going to pretend to read it, or they're going to cry about it secretly and then not tell you that they gave up. Like, that's what people do.
I know. They're going to look for cliff notes.
Yeah. And I would much rather give them something that they're actually going to enjoy and understand and be able to talk about. And we've got so many great writers operating these days. Like, why not throw them some Neil Gaiman?
Did you read the Norse book that he wrote? What is it? The Norse
the Norse mythology book? I did. I didn't think there was enough Freya in it. She's my favorite.
I know, right? I loved it though. I mean, like, it was so entertaining and so informative.
Have you read The Gospel of Loki?
No.
The author escapes me.
I got to write this down.
The Gospel of Loki. It's the stories, but they're from Loki's perspective.
Really? Oh, I got to
go forth. Go forth and read.
I'm actually reading this right now. This radio.
Oh, yeah. That's my favorite edition.
I'm reading it. Well, I'm kind of reading it in two different places, you know.
Yeah.
Because I want to go back and forth. And then the next, I finished your book. The next one is that Besom Stag and Sword. I'm gonna see if I can talk to them.
Oh, they're great. They're a lot of fun. I did a podcast with them last month.
Oh, good. Awesome. Maybe they'll talk to me. I hope so.
I'll tell them.
The other book that I love, because when I was operating the coven, the Lunar Wisdom Coven, The Circle Within.
Diane
that
Sullivan.
was the very first book I picked up from Barnes and Nobles back in 2000, when was it? I think it had just come out. And that I love that book.
Was that your first Wiccan book?
It was.
Wow. Lucky you.
It was.
That's a good
that
one.
was my first, because I came into Wicca and magic and all that at an old. I was an adult. Actually, I was a Jehovah's Witness at the time, and I had my daughter was born 2002, so it was like 2003, 2004, and I I was having conversations with people online about magic. And what it was and what it wasn't, and Wicca and what it was and what it wasn't. I wanted something more than just how to do spells. You know, I was looking for the actual beliefs and practices. And I went to Barnes and Nobles and I saw it. I read the back and I said, I'm reading this.
You know, there still hasn't been. So I love Diane Sullivan. She's got another great one called The Body Sacred.
I read that like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the thing that makes The Circle Within special, even if it's not quite your cup of tea or not your type of Wicca, is how the second half of the book is her. I don't remember what she calls it. She doesn't call it a book of shadows, but it's basically like a collection of poetry and rituals, and they're really lovely. But it's that first chunk of the book, and it's really the first book of its kind that really is talking more about the emotional, kind of like visceral, what's going on inside of you aspect of Wicca. Before that, and even now, most of the books that come out are like, this is what the cauldron is for, and this is how you do a spell. And you can only read so many of those.
Yes.
And I was having a conversation with my friend and coven mate, Corvus. Hi, Corvus. And she was reading something that I'd finished writing. I'm working on a second book right now. And she's my reader. Okay. And what she said to me was like, man, I just love that you're talking to people like they already know what they're doing. Like, it really is just kind of more like next level stuff. And Diane Sullivan kind of does the same thing. Like, she tells you, look, I'm not going to tell you what an Athame does. Let's talk about what's actually like going on theologically. Yeah. And I don't have to agree with everything she says to appreciate what she's trying to do. So that book's important to me too. And it's a great read, especially for solitaries. If you can't find a coven, maybe you're kind of on the fence about joining a coven. That's one of the best books for like building a solitary practice that I've really seen.
I know. And if you're writing a book similar to that kind of concept, I can't wait to read it.
Well, what I told Llewellyn in my proposal was to think of it as like The Circle Within if Diane Sullivan had had too much to drink.
Nice. Yeah, your proposal was due recently.
I wanted to get it in before the New Year's, and I was like a week late, but that's okay.
But
It still
it's
happened,
in.
so whatever.
It's in. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yay. We have only a few minutes left. A question. Divination.
Okay.
You practice divination. Is it cards?
Yes. When I do divination, I like cards, although I recently started exploring pendulum. You'd think I would have done this like years ago, but I didn't. It was one of those things that I kind of ignored when I was coming up. And I'm studying with Christopher Penczak in the Temple of Witchcraft right now.
That's
and
right.
A surprise. Yeah. And anyway, one of the exercises that we were doing had to do with pendulum, and I actually like really dug it. So I've been doing a lot with the pendulum lately, but I'm a tarot fanatic.
Yay.
So yeah, when I do divination, it's tarot, runes, or pendulum.
Nice. What deck are you using, tarot?
I use the Rider-Waite deck exclusively.
Yeah.
I collect decks and I love them, but when it comes to reading, it's usually the Universal Waite, just because I like kind of the softer colors, but It's pretty much straight up Pamela Coleman Smith. She's my girl.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And it's because go ahead, sorry.
I still go back to the
it's because of the Hermetic background. Like, I'm really into the Golden Dawn, and I'm really into Hermeticism, and just the symbolism of the Rider-Waite deck or the Waite-Smith deck just jives with me. So I love it. It's deep and intricate. Anyway, it's my fave. And I'm going to shut up now because it's your turn.
I was just going to say, I go back to that. I mean, I was using the Green Witch because I like Rider-Waite based decks. I like, but then I'm interested in what the artists, their takes on the symbolism that are in that. So, but I recently picked up, the Book of Shadows as Above. I'm not loving it so much. I'm using it. I'm not just as in love with it as I had hoped I would be.
If you kind of like that and you're on the fence about it, you might try Deborah Blake's Everyday Witch Tarot that just came out like last year.
I think I looked at images. I don't know. I'll check it again.
You might be into it. It's kind of the same vibe where it's like young and kind of witchcraft and like contemporary life.
Yeah, that's what I kind of don't like. You know what really got me? The As Above deck, this one image, and I keep this card because it's like that card. This image is what sold me.
Okay.
And I should have just gotten a print of that image, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I know. It is what it is. But I think we're about time. I think it's been about an hour. So if you're watching, make sure you check out all of Thorn's links. It's going to be in the information section. She's everywhere.
Yay. I'm really active on Instagram too, so come find me. She is.
She's got some snippets of her music, her singing and playing the guitar. It's lovely. Huh?
I've usually been drinking.
That's okay. But your music is wonderful. Here, so. Your music is wonderful. You should check her out. I am so happy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yay! Thank you for having me.
Yay! And we look forward to your next book. So yeah, so thank you everyone for watching. And until next week, I don't know what we're doing next week because I forget. But yeah, Obsidian, did you have anything you wanted to? I know you're awfully quiet, but
yeah, I was very silent, but that didn't mean I didn't listen. I listened.
I know you listened.
It was very interesting. So, yeah, j'espère que ça vous aura intéressé autant que ça m'a intéressé moi. Et on ne sait absolument pas ce dont on parle la semaine prochaine, mais c'est pas grave, rejoignez-nous quand même. Bye bye.
Bye everyone until next week. I love you. Blessed be. Bye.